as we promised, we are going to continue with a fireside chat that is titled The Yellow Brick Road to High Assurance with OSCAL. How many of you were here 2 days ago or even yesterday and know what OSCAL is? Good. Considering the total number of participants here and the ones that raised their hand, it's about 30% for the audience that is online, which is good. OSCAL stands for Open Security Controls Assessment Language. But the conversation will not stay focused only on OSCAL. We'll start with the topic of today's conference, the multi-cloud. And I'd like to invite to the podium Brian Ruff, that is Director for Cybersecurity at Easy Dynamics. And as I mentioned before the break, he also serves as the co-chair of the cloud security, of the multi-cloud security at NIST, at the working group at NIST. And Daniele Cattedu, that is the CTO for Cloud Security Alliance. And myself, Michaela Ioga, in case you don't remember since this morning. And I am the Strategic Outreach Director for OSCAL, and also the Chair of Cloud Security Working Group at NIST, the broader forum under which the multi-cloud security working group operates. And also I serve as the Senior Security Technical Lead at NIST in ITL Computer Security Division. I'll change places. Oh, thank you.
Of course. All right, welcome everyone. We're going to, as we get into this session, I think we have about 25 minutes, but I see 50 up there. As we get into this session, we're going to talk briefly about zero trust architecture and multi-cloud security as separate topics, just briefly. We're going to talk about the challenge of putting the two together. And then we're going to talk about the greater challenge of trying to authorize a zero trust architecture in a multi-cloud environment. So we'll start with zero trust. As we probably all know, or many of us know, zero trust architecture is really a cybersecurity plan, an attempt to implement zero trust principles, the core of which is never trust, always verify. This eliminates implicit trusts and enforces accurate, least privilege, per user access decisions. Daniele, can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges faced with zero trust architecture or zero trust implementation?
Yeah, sure. I guess we have heard already quite a lot about the potential challenges this morning. So I guess that mine is going to be just a sort of a recap of many of the items that we have heard during the course of this morning. To start with, so I see zero trust as a sort of function with a tendency towards infinity or towards zero, if you like better. So something that you can aim to, but you will never fully reach. And I guess that is meant to be, the general approach. I don't see any company that it will be in the position to say, work accomplished, well done, finished. That's impossible because we know that trust is a very complicated matter to measure and to achieve. So let's look at it as a tendency. If we don't look at it as a tendency, but as something that it has to achieve 100%, I think that it might represent a barrier. The biggest barrier, though, that I see is very much cultural, no surprise. The idea of moving towards an approach where that is based on the idea of evidence-based trust, it kind of clashes with a lot of the issues that personally I've been seeing in the market over the past 20 years. One is certainly a sort of, idiosyncrasy of our world to deal with risk management, to properly calculate risk, and let alone that idea to be under the realm of continuous risk management. So there is a need certainly to have that substantial cultural shift that it cannot be just tactical. It has to be strategic. it implies that there is, at the highest level within an organization, the commitment of understanding what that cultural shifts should represent, how it should be transmitted towards the rest of the organization, because without that commitment at the highest level, I don't see how that it can be achieved. One of the other issues that it was somewhat transparent over the course of the day today is kind of this idea of having a sort of like snake approach to swallow your prey entirely, which I guess is one of the biggest mistakes we could do. So the idea of being very agile, to decompose the problem in small chunks, avoiding that monolithic approach towards zero trust, I think is going to be key, because otherwise I think it might be very consuming, especially if we think about sort of technical debit that many organizations have for the very foundation of what is supposed to be a sound zero trust approach. So you need to know yourself. You need to have a clear map of your asset, of your entities, being them human devices or pieces of code. I don't see us quite yet. I don't think there are many organizations that are in the position to say, I have a good understanding of myself and my environment. Of course, there are some exceptions. I know of organizations that have been successfully successful in implementing zero trust, but those were mainly cloud native organizations that could have the luxury of starting with a greenfield approach. But that's I would say this a small subset of the majority of the organization, and especially it's not how the most complex organizations are. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
All right, thank you. I think the biggest point I think I heard was that it's definitely a journey and not a big bang approach, but there's a lot of complexity there. Okay, let's move on quickly to multi-cloud deployments, multi-cloud security in particular. And I think we've probably heard a lot today about definitions of multi-cloud and the like. I think we would like to focus this question more on a single workload that's in two different public clouds that are two different business entities. So Michaela, can you tell us some of the challenges that are faced with organizations trying to deploy a workload to two different public clouds?
Absolutely. So I would like to take one step back and acknowledge everything that Daniel said, that we have principle of zero trust just to take us closer to a particular denominator, common denominator there of what is a zero trust understanding. But personally, I still feel that there is a human component there, because what I trust, Daniel might not trust, and vice versa. So how do we get there and how do we demonstrate that? And everything is actually related to the risk approach and the risk tolerance of every individual. Some of the work that we started at NIST and what we are looking into as part of the research is how do we tackle a very hard problem, as Daniel said, not by eating the entire meal at once, but try to look at the challenges of creating or consuming multi-cloud solutions as we perceive them. Multi-cloud solutions, not the ones that are orchestrated by the consumer, because those have a strong component where the consumer can have an input on how it's orchestrating and has that visibility. But looking at the solutions that involve more than one cloud service provider, a solution that is provided to you as a single workload, as you said, and where there is a shared responsibility component there, very strong, who is responsible to what, and how do I perceive as a consumer that solution that is offered to me as a bundle. So those are things that we're looking at, and it's extremely difficult to identify how am I going to understand clearly if that's a single solution offered to me. when I don't have a transparent way of identifying what are their responsibilities, how do they share them, how do they implement those controls if they implement them differently, how do they satisfy them, how do I aggregate all that information, and how do I have an overview of the entire solution. We are very familiar with, and we are trying to move towards a zero trust approach or architecture towards a single cloud, and maybe we got that close enough to that, to native cloud solutions as well, maybe close enough. But think of the complexity of the solution that involves different legal entities, and you have to consume that solution in a way with old methods. So the research that we are doing at NIST is focusing on identifying core challenges there, and then try to see under the umbrella of a working group, because we want to hear from the entire community of experts out there of how can we tackle this problem, because it's extremely complex. Now, if you want us to elaborate more, I know that you are very familiar with that topic as well. So if you'd like to share with us also, Brian, some of the challenges that were currently identified for just looking at the simple certification or authorization to operate, as we refer to it, in a cloud environment, we can both present that, or you can also, if you want to share some of those points.
Sure. Yeah, within the multi-cloud working group, we're especially concerned with how inheritance happens. I mean, inheritance of one workload in one public cloud is well understood, but when you start getting into two separate clouds with different service offerings, different controls that are, where control is implemented differently by the two different public providers, it does represent some unique challenges to an authorizing official that might try to authorize that workload, that single SaaS, in both public clouds. So we're looking hard at trying to formulate recommendations, trying to identify even just where those differences really lie and where they're really similar, and it's just a little bit of a red herring that it's on multi-cloud. So the more we can study that, the better we'll get at identifying where we really need to change the ATO process in order to support a multi-cloud certification or accreditation. We think those lessons learned apply not just in the federal space, but also to other forms of certification, CSA STAR, SOC 2, ISO 27001. So we think that this is research that's going to really benefit the industry.
We are also looking at zero trust principles and how those can be applied to multi-cloud solutions when we refer to multi-cloud solution services in this context that involves more than one cloud service provider, that they orchestrate. They come together and orchestrate and offer to you that solution. So we heard today at length how complex this kind of solutions are. We heard at length today that centralizing the identity management is core to that. The question remains, when you centralize that, do you bring in place another legal entity, and what is the relation between that legal entity and the cloud service provider, and how you technically address that problem? And then take one step further and look at the consumer's perspective. How are they going to understand and accept and deal with that complexity? We also heard today that there is a direction of enforcing the policies closer to the assets. Imagine that you have those assets that are managed by different legal entities. So how do you get that perspective? How do you do that? How do you even technically implement those? So those are challenges that we are trying first to identify, list them, see where is an overlap between the applying ZTA principles to a multi-cloud solution. We question, is this even possible in a real multi-cloud solution like the one we just described, to apply a zero trust principle, to apply all the zero trust principles to that. So it's part of the research that we are doing to be able to then think together, all members of the working group. We have more than 200, I think, members that are collaborating with us and see how can we address the problem. Trying to dissect it into small slices and take, as Danielle said, start eating the cake with one slice at a time.
Yeah. Danielle, do you want to add to the concepts of and challenges of implementing ZTA within a multi-cloud environment?
Sure. Yeah. I guess at least for the sake of my mental sanity, let me take a small step back.
Sure.
Because from what I heard this morning, I'm kind of fearing that there might be a bit of confusion around the very concept of multi-cloud. To me, when I think about multi-cloud, I'm thinking about a multi-infrastructure as a service provider. The idea of having one single infrastructure provider and 1,000 of SaaS application on the top of it, to me, it doesn't classify as a multi-cloud.
Agreed.
Right?
Totally.
So, assuming that everyone is on the same page from this perspective, I guess that from the theoretical perspective, as we also heard, like for a good chunk of this this morning and early afternoon, there are solutions. Think about identity, right? There are solutions that theoretically seem to scale across multiple platforms, multiple hyperscalers, so to be able to bring a coherent framework, for instance, to have a unique source of truth for identity. The problem, though, at least from my perspective, is more on the specific and very vertical skills and expertise that are required in order to enforce, to implement and design and monitor controls across different platforms. Enforcing security controls, we were discussing the day before yesterday during the OSCAL conference about the differences that exist between a control objectives and technical controls. You can bring coherency in a multi-cloud environment at the level of control objectives. When it comes to technical controls, that coherency is not there because many of those controls are difficult to measure or to compare apple to apple, and that's one problem. The other problem is that unless you are a multi-billion organization that can afford specialists for GCP, AWS, and Azure, or IBM Cloud, or Oracle, whatever you want to consider as an hyperscaler, it becomes very difficult to have a sound approach to multi-cloud.
Unless you use some standardized automation.
Well, no, I would disagree with that. I mean, automation and standardization standardization, in generally speaking, yes. You need to get to a point where you are able to compare apple to apple. But then it doesn't solve the problem, the skills and expertise problem.
Oh, absolutely.
We are not going to go away from that. So either we identify that standard that is going to uniform the reading through technical controls across different platforms, or I don't see how we can get with a victory out of that.
So I was trying to challenge you a little bit, fishing a little bit, if you want, towards why you mentioned earlier OSCAL and why you mentioned earlier the earlier conference that we had. You mentioned the mapping between the technical controls and the objectives, and was hoping that we can look into maybe the chance of resolving some of those problems by having all those cloud service providers presenting their security information in a standardized format, allowing to employ same methods, regardless of the type of the technical controls, but to have the same objectives and be able to compare them and be able to aggregate them. So that's where I was trying to take you to see, do you agree or not before I state this?
No, I do. I mean, it's like, you do, but yeah, for the benefit of everyone else, yes, I do agree with that, absolutely. I mean, as I said, defining that same macro language that is going to, to be able to kind of play the role of this, Google Translate for technical controls, if you like. I think it's the way to go, yes.
So we know the federal government is embracing zero trust architecture. We know that it's embracing multi-cloud, clear resources there on both sides. We've already touched on this a little bit, but certainly authorizing zero trust architecture in a multi-cloud environment is a problem we're going to have to solve. What do each of you think in terms of can it be solved, and if so, how?
Well, the magic wand, like I said, is the security automation. The security automation and done with open security controls assessment language, and please don't take that as a sale pitch or something, even though OSCAL or open security controls assessment language is my baby, as I always call it. I think that the level of adoption today is that crosses borders and continents, demonstrates that if we all look into speaking the same language, because it's helping you represent the information, will allow you to constantly assess not only the security controls, but also the requirements of being, or the ones that demonstrate that you are that you meet the zero trust principles. As a matter of fact, a very recent conversation that I had with some colleagues of mine that are working on 863 set of requirements for identity management, they are considering, because the community came to them and said, why don't you represent the requirements also in machine readable format in OSCAL? Because once you represent that in the same format, then they go through that kind of same assessment process, a full recycle, and then existing GRC tools that speak already this language can help with performing this kind of assessment. So it's easier to transfer the data, it's easier to interoperate, and it's easier to accomplish some of those tasks with existing tools.
And if I may, I might shock Michaela with a slight deviation. While I am also involved in OSCAL's creation and it's near and dear to my heart, I do think that for any challenge like this, it is important to get clarity around the processes first, and then define the information needs, and then create the tooling around the information needs in the process. And I do think that has to happen here as well. I think we need to agree on certain standards. I do think that OSCAL is going to be a key part of that answer at the right time in that process. I just also really think we have to agree on what those standards are,
Absolutely.
How we're going to start to build out the maturity in a consistent way, and especially where large organizations like the government can get their arms around it consistently from one agency to the next or one department to the next.
But I'm not shocked at all. I totally agree.
Okay. That's awesome. Daniela, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Maybe as we are, in DC, and where FedRAMP was created, and where most of the organization are very familiar with the process. I'm not going to argue too much into your reading of the situation. Let me come from the perspective of the owner and founder of the CSA STAR program. So looking at certification, attestation, or accreditation, whenever you want to call that process. First of all, trying to make a personal clarification there, which is when we talk about multi-cloud and zero trust, it is not that we need to look at ways in which we can certify against or certify a zero trust process. Mm-hmm. Zero trust is an enabler to achieve potentially in a better way the requirements of a certain accreditation certification scheme. With that in mind, The other area where I have a bit of a confusion is the following. If you're certifying a service, you're not certifying a multi-cloud. So unless you're certifying a SaaS application that is based on a multi-cloud environment, in which case, within the scope of that evaluation, the auditor would need to verify if the controls that the SaaS application owns scaled downward on the 2 or 3 or whatever number of infrastructure as a service provider they're sitting on the top. But from the perspective of the infrastructure as a service, and the problem is a known problem, really. They are not going to be in a situation of multi-cloud because they are the cloud. So the idea of a challenge around multi-cloud and FedRAMP, I don't see that as very compelling because it seemed to me that we are sort of fictitiously discussing a known problem.
Thank you.
I don't know, to be honest. I want to allow time for questions from the audience, but one of the first concern that I had when we were starting working on authorizations for multi-cloud solutions is I personally argue that if you authorize individual cloud service providers that then next day come together to offer a solution that they put together is not that I orchestrated, those two authorizations are not additive.
Absolutely not, yes.
So if that's not the case, how can I create a bundle of the two of them and identify each of their assets? Do they really exchange that information among them for me to have it in one place? How do I treat it? So those are some of the challenges that we are trying to identify, document them very well to be able to look into, is there any mitigation for that? Is there any best practice guidance that we can provide and not in a silo just us government, but with a private sector out there too, in collaboration, we all have to hold hands on coming forward and see how are we going to proceed to do the best that we can.
And especially when you consider things like holistic monitoring of a single workload across multiple infrastructure as service, as an example. There's some unique challenges there with the ongoing level of effort, the consistency. I do think zero trust principles are going to greatly help solve some of those problems. So I actually think the two work well together, zero trust and multi-cloud, and pursuing the two jointly will probably result in better success than either alone. So I think we do have some questions.
We get one in cheat.
How critical is the robustness of the development team's process maturity, CMMI, to achieving high assurance?
I cannot talk on behalf of CMMI.
This is asking really about the development team's process maturity, right? So I believe this is really focusing on those who implement the system according to the requirements. And while I'm not well versed in CMMI, I know really with any framework like that, you do want a team and a process that is going to understand the requirements well. Typically, CMMI, as with other same frameworks, you're going to have strong configuration management. So you'll want a team that embraces that and not a team that, or a process that doesn't handle configuration management well, change management well. And I think that the higher the level of maturity there, will increase your chance of success.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We are out of time.
Right.
I know we are all happy to talk after the session and answer other questions that you may have. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you very much. I'm changing the hat.
Yes.
Thank you.